For 7 years, the boy lived in a world of absolute silence. His billionaire father flew in specialists from every corner of the globe, spending $50,000 an hour just for them to say the same two words: "It's impossible." They all looked at the data, they analyzed the scans, they reviewed the charts, but not one of them actually looked at the child. Then a laundry maid, hired to be invisible, noticed something the world's best doctors had missed: a tiny pulsing light deep inside the boy's ear. Something the medical reports swore wasn't there. Something that shouldn't exist. What she pulled out with a pair of kitchen tweezers would shatter a billionaire's world and expose a betrayal worth $50 million. But before we dive into this story, I need to know where in the world you're watching from right now. I want to see how far this story travels, because what happens next will prove that truth has no borders. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this are what we do. Now let me take you inside the Blackwood estate, where $50 million is about to buy the wrong kind of silence. Silas Blackwood wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of rich that could reshape reality itself. The man who owned the world's data, who could transmit 1 billion terabytes across the globe in a heartbeat, had tried everything money could buy. Johns Hopkins, Swiss clinics, Tokyo's most renowned neurosurgeons, experimental treatments that didn't even have names yet. Every single one returned with the same verdict: his 7-year-old son, Noah's deafness was irreversible. A cruel twist of biology that even billions couldn't fix. Noah was all Silas had left. After his wife died, the grand Blackwood estate transformed from a home into a sterile museum of grief, a monument to everything money couldn't buy back. The boy sat in silence, building towers of blocks in a world Silas couldn't reach, no matter how many zeros he wrote on a check. The miracle wouldn't come from a laboratory. It wouldn't arrive in a private jet with letters after its name. It would come from Clara June, a desperate woman hired to dust the corners and stay invisible, who owed 3 months' rent and had a mother's medical bills crushing her like lead. She was supposed to be a shadow, silent, unseen, forgotten. But Clara was the only one brave enough to see the truth hiding in plain sight. The silence within the Blackwood estate didn't just hang in the air. It felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against the mahogany walls of the study. Silas Blackwood sat in the dim glow of his monitors, his face etched with a fatigue that no amount of billions could buy away. On the primary screen, a grainier, warmer reality played on loop. His late wife, her head tilted back in a laugh that seemed to vibrate with life, singing a lullaby that Silas could still hear in the hollow spaces of his memory. He watched her lips move, a silent ghost of a woman who had been the only music in his calculated world. He turned his gaze from the screen to the floor, where 7-year-old Noah sat. The boy was a mirror image of his mother, the same defiant spark in his eyes, the same gentle curve of the jaw, but he was currently building a tower of crystalline blocks in a world of absolute, unpierceable quiet. Silas watched him intently, waiting for a flicker of recognition, a flinch at the sudden chime of a grandfather clock, or even a reaction to the high-definition audio pouring from the speakers. But Noah remained oblivious, trapped in a sensory vacuum that Silas had spent 7 years trying to bridge. A notification pinged on his tablet, cutting through his reverie like a blade. It was the latest diagnostic from Dr. Eris. Silas didn't need to open the file to know what it contained. The header alone, status, irreversible, told the story of his failure. The Blackwood curse, the tabloids called it. The man who owned the world's data, who could transmit 1 billion terabytes across the globe in a heartbeat, was incapable of sending a single "I love you" to the person who mattered most. Dr. Eris's report detailed the neural bridge protocols, emphasizing that despite the millions poured into the foundation, Noah's auditory nerves remained unresponsive. It suggested more invasive calibrations, more funding, and more patience. Silas felt the familiar, cold obsidian of grief hardening in his chest. He had climbed the peaks of Silicon Valley, dismantled competitors, and reshaped the digital age, yet he stood powerless before the small boy on the rug. Every specialist, every laboratory, and every genius he had hired had returned the same verdict. Silence was Noah's destiny. Silas leaned back, the blue light of the video reflecting in his eyes, unaware that the secret to his son's silence wasn't a biological failure, but a digital betrayal lurking just out of sight. Clara June stood at the service entrance of the Blackwood estate, her fingers trembling as she smoothed the stark apron of her new uniform. The towering iron gates had felt like the jaws of a trap, but the woman standing before her was the real predator. Mrs. Danvers, the head housekeeper, possessed a spine made of iron and eyes that seemed to calculate Clara's net worth and find it lacking in a single sweeping glance. Without a word of welcome, the tour began, a dizzying march through corridors of cold marble and silent, museum-quality rooms. The air in the mansion was thin, filtered, and devoid of the chaotic warmth of the world Clara had left behind. "You are not here to be seen, and you are certainly not here to be heard," Mrs. Danvers said, her voice a low, rhythmic snap that echoed off the high ceilings. "In this house, you are the help. You are a shadow that moves through the rooms to erase the dust of living. You are never to look at the boy, and you are never, ever to touch the master's property." Clara nodded instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt less like a person, and more like a ghost being haunted by the very walls she was hired to clean. As they passed a grand hallway lined with portraits of the Blackwood lineage, Clara's pocket vibrated with a sharp, insistent buzz. She didn't need to look to know what it was. Her phone screen, cracked and dim, was undoubtedly displaying another final notice from her landlord, a digital countdown to homelessness that had been her constant companion for 3 months. The debt from her mother's illness sat on her chest like lead, a weight that made the oppressive rules of the Blackwood mansion feel like a necessary sanctuary. Mrs. Danvers stopped abruptly in front of a heavy set of double doors, her gaze narrowing as she noticed Clara's momentary distraction. "The master prizes silence above all else," the older woman warned, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Break that silence, and you'll find yourself back in the gutter before the sun sets." Clara clutched her cleaning rags tighter, the vibration in her pocket finally ceasing, leaving her in the heavy, expensive quiet of the House of Secrets. She was a shadow now, a desperate soul bound by a paycheck, unaware that her eyes would soon see the one thing the billionaire's millions had failed to find. Clara moved through the nursery like a specter, her movements practiced and hushed as she polished the silver accents that lined the boy's silent sanctuary. Noah was sitting on the plush carpet, his back to her, meticulously stacking transparent cubes with a focus that seemed to block out the very air around him. The stillness of the room was absolute, until Clara's hip brushed against a heavy silver tray perched precariously on a side table. It tumbled, striking the hardwood floor with a violent, metallic crash that echoed like a gunshot in the sterile quiet. Clara froze, her breath hitching as she waited for the inevitable reprimand from Mrs. Danvers. Or worse, the cold gaze of Silas Blackwood. She looked at Noah, expecting him to remain as oblivious as the medical report suggested. He didn't turn. He didn't jump. But as Clara leaned closer, she saw it. The sharp, involuntary dilation of his pupils and a microscopic wince that rippled across his jawline. His small hands tightened around a glass block until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't deaf to the sound. He was reacting to it as if it were a physical blow. A cold shiver of realization raced down Clara's spine. The specialists claimed his world was a void, but Noah's body told a different story. Emboldened by a sudden, desperate curiosity, Clara waited until he settled, then reached out and tapped the wooden surface of his playtable. Not a loud knock, but a rhythmic, persistent vibration. Noah's shoulders hunched. When she began to hum a low, resonant note, his eyelids flickered rapidly, his face twisting not in a search for sound, but in a struggle against it. It wasn't that he couldn't hear. It was that the world was reaching him in a distorted, agonizing tidal wave of sensory overload. Every vibration seemed to be hitting him with the force of a scream, forcing him to retreat into a self-imposed shell of silence just to survive the pain. Clara watched him, her heart aching as she realized the Blackwood curse wasn't a lack of sense. It was a sensory prison. She looked at the door, half expecting the shadows to shift, realizing she had just discovered a truth that millions of dollars had failed to buy. Noah was drowning in sound, and the world was calling it silence. The heavy oak door creaked on its hinges, and the fragile connection Clara had established with Noah shattered instantly. Mrs. Danvers stood in the threshold, her silhouette sharp and accusatory against the dim hallway light. Before Clara could pull her hand back from the table she had been tapping, the head housekeeper was across the room, her footsteps silent, but her presence thundering. "I told you to be a shadow, June," Mrs. Danvers hissed, her voice a serrated blade that made Clara's blood run cold. "Shadows do not interact. Shadows do not touch. If I find you hovering over the boy again, you won't just be fired. You will be blacklisted from every estate in this city." Clara opened her mouth to explain, to speak of the flinch, the pupils, the hidden agony. But the words died in her throat as a second figure appeared. Silas Blackwood moved past the nursery door with the detached grace of a man walking through a gallery of statues. He didn't stop. He didn't even turn his head toward the son who shared his eyes. To Silas, Noah was a broken machine he had already paid the world's best mechanics to fix, and the sight of him was merely a reminder of a debt that couldn't be settled. Watching him, Clara saw the invisible barrier more clearly than ever, a glass wall thicker than any mountain, separating a father's grief-hardened heart from a son's silent suffering. Later that evening, while organizing the heavy mahogany desk in Silas's private study, Clara's eyes caught a stray document peeking out from a folder labeled The Silence Project. It was a medical invoice from the Blackwood Medical Board, stamped with the signature of Dr. Eris. Her eyes scanned the line items, settling on a recurring charge that appeared every 7 days: weekly calibration, neural bridge interference. The word felt wrong, mechanical and cold. Why would a child born with supposedly dead nerves need calibration? You calibrate a radio to catch a signal. You calibrate a jammer to block one. The realization sat in her stomach like a stone. Silas was paying millions for a cure, but the bills suggested someone was being paid to maintain a setting. Clara clutched the paper, the final notice from her landlord forgotten in her pocket. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a witness to a crime hidden in plain sight. And the glass wall wasn't just between father and son, it was being reinforced by the very hands Silas trusted to tear it down. The afternoon sun bled through the nursery's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long golden bars across Noah's sleeping form. Clara moved with the cautious grace of a thief, her pulse thrumming in her ears as she approached the child's bed. Mrs. Danvers was occupied with the silver inventory, and Silas was locked away in a board meeting, leaving a rare, fragile window of opportunity. Noah lay on his side, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, his small face finally free of the tension that plagued his waking hours. Clara leaned in, her heart hammering against her ribs. She adjusted the small penlight she had lifted from the supply closet, angling the beam into Noah's right ear. At first, there was only the natural shadow of the canal. But then, as she shifted her hand, something caught the light. It wasn't the dull yellow of wax or the soft pink of skin. Deep within the ear, pressed dangerously close to the drum, was a microscopic, artificial glint, a speck of cold, polished chrome. It was a jagged, mechanical intruder in a space that should have been purely biological. Clara's breath hitched. This wasn't a bridge to help him hear. It was a physical barrier, a surgical anchor that didn't belong in a 7-year-old's head. Driven by a cold, righteous fury, Clara turned to the high-tech medical tablet resting on the nightstand. It was the hub for Noah's calibration data, usually guarded by the doctors like a holy relic. Her fingers flew across the glass, navigating the menus she had watched Dr. Eris manipulate from a distance. She found the logs for the neural bridge, but as she tried to open the frequency files, a red warning flashed. Encrypted. Level 4 authorization required. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Silas Blackwood owned the company that manufactured the tablet, the house it sat in, and the very air they breathed, yet his own son's medical data was locked away from him behind a wall of encryption he didn't control. The doctors weren't just failing to cure Noah, They were actively hiding the truth of what they had done to him. The Blackwood curse wasn't a twist of fate. It was a high-tech conspiracy. Clara looked back at the tiny glint of chrome in Noah's ear, knowing she was looking at a cage made of silicon and greed. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the only person in the world who knew that Noah's silence had a serial number. The mansion was transformed into a stage for a grand deception. Catering staff moved like clockwork, setting up a gala that felt more like a funeral for Silas Blackwood's fortune than a celebration of hope. In the center of the grand hall, a mahogany podium held the documents that would transfer $50 million to Dr. Eris's foundation. The final push, the doctor claimed, to break the silence. Silas stood by the window, his silhouette rigid, convinced that this massive sacrifice would finally buy his son's freedom. He was a man who solved every problem with a checkbook, never realizing he was merely gold-plating the bars of Noah's cage. Clara found him in the study, minutes before the cameras were to roll. Her heart felt like a trapped bird against her ribs, but the image of that chrome glint in Noah's ear gave her a desperate strength. "Mr. Blackwood, please," she started, her voice trembling but clear. "The medical reports, they aren't what they seem. I've seen something in Noah's ear. It's not a cure, it's a device. He's in pain, sir. He's flinching because of the interference, not his nerves." Silas didn't even turn around. His gaze remained fixed on the lawn below. "You are a laundry maid, Clara," he said, his voice cold and weary. "You see shadows where there are none because you want to be helpful. But I have the world's leading neurosurgeons telling me the truth. Do not mistake your distractions for expertise." The dismissal was total, a wall of glass as thick as the one between him and his son. As Clara backed out of the room, she collided with the ironclad presence of Mrs. Danvers. The head housekeeper's face was a mask of cold triumph. She held a single crisp manila folder, the termination papers Clara had feared since her first day. "I warned you about the fire, June," Mrs. Danvers whispered, her eyes devoid of pity. "Your things will be at the service gate by morning. You're done here." Clara stood in the hallway, a fired maid with a final notice in her pocket and a world-shattering secret in her head. She looked toward the nursery where Noah sat in his silent high-tech prison. Silas was about to sign away his legacy to the men who were torturing his child, and the only person who knew the truth was being erased from the house. She had no money, no job, and no authority. But as she watched Dr. Aris adjust his tie for the cameras, Clara realized that being a shadow had one advantage. Nobody expected the shadow to fight back. The gala began with a deceptive elegance, the grand hall flooded with the elite and the hum of artificial expectations. Silas stood at the podium, his hand hovering over the document that would seal his son's fate, while Dr. Aris watched with a predatory smile. But as the lead surgeon leaned into the microphone to speak, a sharp, piercing burst of high-frequency feedback tore through the sound system. The audience winced, but for Noah, the noise was a physical assault. The hidden jammer in his ear, agitated by the frequency, began to pulse with a blinding heat. Noah didn't just flinch this time. He let out a guttural, agonizing scream, a sound the experts had sworn he was biologically incapable of producing. The room fell into a stunned, horrified silence as the boy's eyes rolled back and he collapsed onto the marble floor, his small body convulsing in a silent seizure. In the paralyzed chaos that followed, while Silas stood frozen in shock and security scrambled to block the cameras, Clara June moved. She didn't wait for permission. She broke her shadow status, scooped Noah's limp body into her arms, and bolted toward the service doors before anyone could stop her. She burst into the stainless steel sanctuary of the staff kitchen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She knew she had seconds before security found her, seconds to prove the impossible. She laid Noah on the central island, his face contorted in pain. With trembling hands, she reached for a high-powered industrial magnet from the refrigerator door and grabbed a pair of fine-tipped tweezers from her apron. "Trust me, baby," she whispered. Though he couldn't hear her, she pressed the magnet against the side of his skull, using the force to draw the chrome intruder away from the delicate nerves of the eardrum. As the magnetic pull worked, The tiny glint she had seen in the dark began to shift toward the surface. With the precision of a woman who had spent years mending the fragile, Clara slid the tweezers into the canal. She felt a sharp resistance, a mechanical click of a device losing its grip, and then she pulled. A tiny, pulsing black microchip, no larger than a grain of rice, and still flickering with a malevolent red light, came free. Noah's body instantly went slack, the tension draining out of him as the digital static finally ceased. He gasped, his eyes fluttering open as they fixed on Clara. In the sudden, profound quiet of the kitchen, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, a sound Noah had lived 7 years without. He tilted his head, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated wonder. As the miracle of a common ticking clock became the first true sound of his life, the heavy kitchen doors swung open with a violent crash as Silas Blackwood stormed in, flanked by 2 stone-faced security guards. His face was a mask of primal terror and fury, his eyes landing on Clara as if she were a monster. "Get away from him!" Silas roared, his voice cracking with the strain of a father who thought he had lost everything. The guards moved forward, their hands reaching for Clara's arms to haul her toward a prison cell, but they stopped dead in their tracks when they saw the boy. Noah was not unconscious, and he was no longer seizing. He was standing on the stainless steel counter, his head tilted at a curious angle as he stared at the humming industrial refrigerator. He wasn't looking at the world with the hollow, distant gaze of the deaf. He was listening. As Silas skidded to a halt, the room fell into a vacuum of anticipation. Noah slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting his father's for the first time with a look of absolute clarity. The boy's lips parted, trembling as he tested a medium he had never owned. "Quiet," Noah whispered, his voice small and raspy from years of disuse. "It's quiet now." The silence that followed was different from the one that had haunted the Blackwood mansion for years. This wasn't a void. It was a peace. Silas fell to his knees, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged sob as he heard his son speak for the first time in 7 years. He reached out a shaking hand, but his eyes drifted to Clara, who stood pale and steady beside the boy. Without a word, Clara opened her palm. Resting in the center of her hand was the nightmare she had pulled from the dark. The tiny black microchip was still slick with a trace of blood, its internal LED flickering a faint, dying red before finally going dark. It looked like a parasite, a mechanical leech designed to thrive on a child's silence and a father's desperation. Silas stared at the piece of chrome and silicon, the neural bridge he had paid $50 million to build, and realized it was nothing more than a lock. Clara placed the evidence into his hand, the metal cold and heavy. "The doctors didn't want him to hear you, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, her voice steady now that the truth was finally out in the light. "Because if he could hear, they'd lose their gold mine." Silas gripped the chip until the edges dug into his skin, the realization of the betrayal finally burning through the last of the glass wall. The transition from the grand gala to the sterile reality of a police investigation happened with the clinical efficiency of a Blackwood corporate takeover. Silas Blackwood did not just call the authorities. He unleashed his entire technological empire, tracing the serial numbers on the pulsing black microchip back through shell companies and encrypted servers until they led directly to a secret basement laboratory beneath Dr. Eris's foundation. Within hours, the elite surgeons who had feasted on Silas's grief were being led out in handcuffs, charged with aggravated battery of a minor and a decade of medical fraud. The Silence Project was revealed to be a high-tech extortion ring, but the headlines meant nothing to the man currently sitting on the plush carpet of the nursery floor. The mansion was no longer a museum of grief. It was becoming a home. Silas sat cross-legged, his expensive suit forgotten, simply watching Noah. There were no tablets, no specialists, and no calibrations. Instead, Silas spoke, soft, rambling stories about Noah's mother, the stars, and the way the wind sounded in the trees. Each word was a gift, and Noah caught them all, his eyes wide and curious, as he mimicked the shapes of his father's lips. The Blackwood curse had been broken, not by a wire or a wire transfer, but by the simple, terrifying act of removing a lie. Clara stood in the doorway, her coat in her hand, and her final notice still in her pocket, ready to return to the world of shadows she had come from. She expected to be forgotten now that the miracle was complete, but Silas looked up, his gaze fixing on her with a profound, humbling clarity. He didn't see a maid or a shadow anymore. He saw the woman who had possessed the one thing his billions could never buy: the courage to see his son's pain when the rest of the world saw only a paycheck. "You aren't going anywhere, Clara," Silas said, his voice thick with a gratitude that transcended his status. "The debt is gone. The house is yours for as long as you want it. You gave him back the world." Clara looked at Noah, who was currently laughing at the sound of his own fingers tapping against a wooden block, and felt the weight of her own worries finally lift. In the new world they had built together, the only thing that mattered was the messy, beautiful noise of a child discovering his voice. Sometimes the loudest voices are the ones we ignore because they don't have the right credentials. Silas Blackwood had all the money in the world, but it was Clara's courage that finally broke the silence. If this story touched your heart, don't let the truth stay hidden. Hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of truth seekers.